Hello, everybody, and welcome to Whitelock Fever Live. We've been gone for a couple of weeks, but we are back. And thanks to everyone who's joining us on a few different platforms today, including the people who support the various projects I'm involved in on Patreon. Welcome, Patreon. Before we introduce our guest, what a game of footy we just saw. South Sydney 26, West Tigers 24. West Tigers never led, but they were yapping at the heels of the Bunnies right up till the end there. Really good Thursday morning where I am in London. A great way to start the day. And I have to mention, every time I do something under the White Line Fever brand, our VIP supporters, Adam Perry and Annie Massey. I don't need to look at my notepad, particularly for Adam Perry, because he's a great customer of Mascord Browns. Okay, our guest is the author of Rugby League: A People's History. It's been out for less than a week. Tony Collins. Tony, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks for having me on, Steve. It's a great privilege and a pleasure.
The privilege is all ours. Now I've read the details, I can take my glasses off. I don't know where to start, really. I mean, we could talk, given that your area of expertise goes back to 1895 and beyond. Well, we could start in 1895, but then we'd be on all day. So let's talk about your new book, which is Rugby League: A People's History. What is, as a layperson, can you tell us what is a people's history? What is that whole idea?
Well, the idea is that it tells the story of the game from the people who made it. So, most books about history of sport tell the great stories about the teams, the players, the matches, and that's in it. There's lots of stuff about that. But what I wanted to do with this book was actually also tell the story of the people who made it, about what it was like to be a player in the 1890s or the 1930s, what it was like to be a fan, how did fans help their clubs in the during the Great Depression. So it's really a story that encompasses the whole of the rugby league community, whether you're an immortal professional like Harold Wagstaff, or whether you're playing for Eastmoor Dragons, who also feature in the book, Wakefield amateur team. It covers everybody, because I think the important thing about history is that it belongs to the people who make it. So a people's history is the attempt to tell the story of rugby league through the people who made it.
Right, and how have the first was less than a week of sales, isn't it? Is it less than a week, or is it just a bit over a week? How's the response been?
Just a bit over the week, because it came out on the day, which is fantastic. I've got to take my hat off to Scratch and Shade Publications. It came out on the day of the 125th anniversary of the game, on the 29th of August this year. So it's been out, where are we now? Yeah, about 11 days. So, and it's doing really well. I think I've worn out 2 pens signing copies. So yeah, it's really pleasing. It's going to the people for whom it was intended.
That's great. That's great. And can you tell us, I mean, there's so many different things we can discuss, but one of the things that has occurred to me over the last kind of week, when I've seen David Moffat come out and say that he's starting a new version of rugby, and there's 10s and there's 9s and there's 7s, and there's, touch. I mean, here in London, rugby league doesn't have a huge profile, you wouldn't think, but I see people playing the ball when I go for a walk in the park every day, because they're playing tag rugby, which my business partner Phil Brown was involved in popularising here. And when we kind of venerate this schism, we do so because it was the birthplace of rugby league. But don't we now have schisms all the time within the broader game of rugby?
Well, there's always been schisms going back to when it first emerged out of rugby school in the 1860s, because, in a sense, the first schism was with Aussie rules, which started off as a game based on the rugby school version of what was then called football. And then you've got American football, Canadian football. They all kind of develop out of rugby in the same way that rugby league develops out of rugby. And I think also, but I mean, the modern versions, and obviously you get the same thing with the reviewed various versions. They're really a way of they've become ways of trying to expand the game, making the game more accessible to people, and so they're not really the same as the split of Aussie rules or American football or league and union. They're more the attempts of of the different types of rugby to popularise their version. So, I mean, like seven-a-side rugby union. It's not a different game to rugby union. I mean, it might develop in 100 years' time to be that, but it's part and parcel of promoting the game, and that's what rugby league has been doing with Nines.
Yeah, my point though is that it really it might be a bit esoteric, but what defines rugby league now, given that many different rules and in rugby union as well, what defines them is now almost who's sitting in a chair in an office. It's who administers them, because there are so many different variations now, as I said, from tag to right up to very traditional 15-a-side rugby union, that really the only thing that's I guess the only thing that really separates them if you were to arrive from Mars and look at them all, would be that some groups are run by one administration and some groups are run by another. And yet we attach so much emotion and identity in these definitions that were sort of drawn up 125 years ago, when in fact since then there have been many other meetings at the George, as in rugby league worldwide was run by a different governing body for almost 2 years during the period covered by the book I'm writing at the moment. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that we go back to 1895 because it's so important to us, but really the general code of rugby has divided and subdivided, and all that we're left with now to separate them and define them is the administrations.
Well, I think the thing that separates them, and you may say he would say that, wouldn't he, is history. Mm-hmm. Because it's people when people refer to the games, by and large, they demonstrate their loyalty to the game or their love of the game by referring to its past, what it represents, either in terms of the way the rules are or its social history, like obviously a lot of people in rugby league do. And that is what defines how those games are today. Because as you say, if you're a visiting Martian and you come down and you look at all the different games, you're going to think, well, obviously with League and Union, there's not too great a difference to an outsider. Mm-hmm. And even when you look at, to be honest, the oddest division is between Canadian and American football, where it's the same game, just that one has 12 players, the other has 11. One has 4 downs, one has 3 downs. There's almost nothing to choose between them. However, what separates them is the weight of their heritage, that people have become attached to the stories that those games tell. Mm. Whether it's about your nation or your region or your class or just how you want to identify with the world. And in a sense, sports have become like Greek myths. In the way that the Greeks invented myths to explain how they saw the world, to explain the world around them. Well, we're the same with sports. If you're a rugby union person, you interpret the world in a particular way. And rugby union's history allows you to do that. And that's exactly the same with rugby league. And in a sense, I think if you're, I can't imagine there are many non-rugby league people watching this. If you're like us and you're a rugby league diehard, then that history is something that you identify with, and it's a way of dividing yourself from the other types of rugby or the other types of football, in fact,
or the other types of people. That's
right. Yeah, and that's what it comes down to.
Yeah. I did an interview last week, and I was honoured to be thought of. I think. You were also interviewed for this documentary coming up on the BBC, and obviously it's an obvious thing to come to you. If they didn't, they should have. But Tom, the director, made the point that if rugby league, and this is a common trope, and it particularly comes into focus around the Toronto Wolfpack, that if rugby league changes too much, it'll cease to be what everyone loves about it. And that, Tom's views seem to be that, which we hear from a lot of people, that the game shouldn't stray far from its northern roots, because then it will lose the thing that makes it different. I won't make it a leading question I'll just leave it there. But I wonder what your thoughts are about that idea.
It's complicated, as they say. I think there's a very big element of truth in that, and that obviously, I know people don't like using the word heartland to describe, the post-industrial north of England where rugby league is based, but that's the reality of it. And that, given the nature of the history of the game and where it finds its strength, where it draws its strength from, then that's inevitable. So, yeah, it's that Northern English working class sense of identity is always going to be very strong. However, on the other hand, if you look at the history of the game, not only has that been strong, but also the game has a long history of looking outwards. And again, you and me have been around in rugby league for long enough to know that there's an essential division in rugby league between expansionists and what you might want to call more traditionalist members of the community. But I think that represents the contradiction in the game, because it broke away and formed the Northern Rugby Football Union. But in a lot of ways, it also had ambitions to become a national sport. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the Challenge Cup was started in 1897, because it wanted to be the equivalent, rugby's equivalent of the FA Cup, a national rugby knockout competition. And also, it constantly looked beyond its borders, either within England or internationally. So, so there's the very strong link with Wales, and then you get the New Zealand and Australia coming into the game. There's initial attempts to try and get the game into France before the First World War. And if you look at the history of perhaps the time when the game was at its most popular, when crowds were extraordinarily high, immediately after the Second World War into the 1940s and 1950s. One of the things that marked rugby league then was not only was it very strong in its heartlands, but also it had this additional component of, if you like, cosmopolitan glamour, because it had lots of players coming in from overseas. Australians in particular, like Brian Bevan and other Hall of Famers, scattered around the different clubs. There are also Fijians coming into the game, Tongans, South Africans, black South Africans who couldn't even play first-class rugby in their own country. France was there. You also had, Canada's first experiments with rugby league were taking place in the 40s and 50s. So it's always been there. And I think there's no reason why the game can't protect and preserve what it's always had in the north of England, while also pursuing that that goal of, it's got to be planned and strategic, but pursuing that goal of expansion to places where its style of play and its sense of itself, its philosophy, if you like, has a wider resonance. And I think the Wolfpack proved that can be done. I mean, this is leaving aside how the club was run and all the rest of it, but simply the fact you could set up a club in Toronto, and within a couple of seasons you've got the best part of 10,000 people coming to see a sport that did not exist in that city, demonstrates the potential there is there.
Tony, I'm guessing that, or perhaps, given your area of expertise, you could look back till 1895, and within rugby league, you could almost draw a graph of ups and downs. Maybe you could shade them different colours for different barometers, whether it's playing strength, media profile, sponsorship, expansion, whatever. I'm guessing maybe you could paint that picture in your mind. Could you? Do you think, or not?
Yeah, although you'd probably get seasick watching the waves of upwards and downwards.
Exactly. So the reason, that's a leading question, because I'm curious as to whether where we are now. So where are we on? Just are we on a? Is any of the progress that we've seen in recent years permanent? Judged on your sort of knowledge of these things happening before?
Yeah, I think so, because I think, well, if you look at the game internationally, then I'm old enough to remember when the World Cup was played by just four nations. The first World Cup I can remember is 1970. Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand and France. And that was it. There was probably a little bit played in Papua New Guinea, but we didn't really know about that. But that was it. So in the space of 50 years, we've gone from just 4 nations to, a World Cup next year. It's going to have 16. There's probably another dozen or so affiliated to International Rugby League now. So, yeah, that's a tremendous strength. And I think even in Britain, where the game has been hit hard over the last 10 to 15 years by a whole series of events beyond its control, austerity, deindustrialization, and just the poverty that has come to dominate the north of England. We're in a position where we've had more. There are now clubs played in pretty much every county in England, which would have been unthinkable in 1970. And even the gates that clubs get in the Super League, they've declined a bit since 2007, 2008, when I think it's consistent average of 10,000 per season. But nevertheless, they're still higher than they have been since the early 1960s. So, we're a sport, and I'm as prone to this as anybody else. We're a sport that easily reverts to the doom and gloom scenario. And again, in 1970, Ron Chester, who was then a director of Hull KR, which happens to be my club, said that rugby league isn't dying, it's dead. And here we are 50 years later, and we're in a completely different space. So the game goes up and down. That's not to say it's an automatic process of going up. We're now in new circumstances that the game hasn't confronted before. Rugby union is professional. We've lost a great deal of the player pool that we had in Wales. I mean, obviously there's still some players, Regan Grace, Ben Fowler and so on coming up from Wales. But the idea that the Welsh Rugby Union captain is going to sign for one of our clubs is not going to happen in the foreseeable future, as it did before 1995, or as it could do. So we've lost that. The north of England is significantly poorer than what it has been at any point over the last century.
Wow.
So for example, I'm going to give you an example. If you look at, and you may as well have seen this stat somewhere else, the 5 of the 10 English Super League clubs are in the areas that are ranked in the bottom 10% for social deprivation in Britain, and the other 5 are in the next 20%. So that shows, so that shows the difficulties that the game's up against. But there are, again, using Toronto to some extent, Toulouse and Catalans, there are possibilities for the game to expand its market and look to new areas that can bring in, wealth, support, and interest in the game when the north of England isn't doing so well. So, yeah, it's a difficult time, and it requires some strategic leadership that acknowledges these problems and can figure out a way forward. But I don't think things are anywhere as near as bad as what sometimes people imagine they are.
So what do you, I guess there was some news yesterday here where, the Super League table was going to go on percentages rather than competition points because of the fear that some clubs wouldn't be able to complete their schedules this year due to COVID-19. What did you make of that decision, and can you tell the viewers and listeners about the precedents for that sort of system?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that being in the middle of a global pandemic is a new situation for all sports. Well, for society. There was a flu pandemic in 1918 and 1919, but sport was very different then. And also in the case of Britain, the season really didn't start until after the pandemic had passed through Britain. So so there's no real equivalent of what's going on today. The nearest equivalent is wartime, when clubs dropped out, and in the Second World War, the league table for 2 or 3 seasons was decided by percentage. Because, obviously you've got the threat of German bombers coming and dropping bombs on grounds, which is what happened, and a match has been cancelled at very short notice. So there's no way you could guarantee that all clubs would play the same game. So you had to use percentages. So that's kind of the nearest precedent for what's going on, but it's still not entirely accurate because they still had crowds. They still knew by and large, what was going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen with the pandemic. The other precedent is more straightforward. From 1906 to 1930, the league table, the final positions in the league table was decided by win-loss percentages. The reason for this was because the clubs didn't all play the same number of games. There was a slightly ad hoc system where clubs would, by and large, choose their own fixture list within reasons. It had to be endorsed by the RFL. But the RFL didn't sit down, as it does today, and draw up a fixture list for all clubs. And so because of the imbalance between the number of games that clubs would play, the final standings in the table were decided on percentage points. And that's why the championship playoff system was introduced. So the top four in the league would play off to decide who would play in the championship final. And the reason for the playoffs was to make sure that the top clubs could be tested against each other, regardless of whether they'd played the same number of games or not. So it's not an entirely new phenomenon. We had it for 25 seasons, or almost 25 seasons. And, given the situation, it's an unprecedented situation that the game finds itself in. It's probably the least worst option that could be chosen. And in a sense, I think it's a good job the decision has been taken now rather than further down the track in a month or so when it would really become even more confusing.
Right. Before I've got more sort of contemporary questions, but I guess for the viewers and listeners who don't know much about you, we probably should, fill them in a little bit. How does one become a rugby historian? I mean, where did this journey begin?
I'm not. Oddly enough, I'm not a historian of rugby because I'm a rugby league fan. I was born and bred into a rugby league family in East Hull. My father took me to watch Hull KR when I was 8 years old. His father took him, and his father took him. So it goes back a long way. So I don't really even regard rugby league as a sport. It's just part and parcel of everyday life. But that's not the reason. That's not the main reason why I study it. The reason why I study it is because when I was looking around for a subject to do as a history PhD way back in the early 1990s, I wanted to do something about the way that the changes in British society in the end of the Victorian era and the period up to the First World War, things like the growth of the Labour Party, the trade unions, the way that British society really became a modern society at that period. And after trawling around various subjects, it occurred to me that nobody had actually looked at why rugby split into league and union. And so I did a PhD on it, which became Rugby's Great Split. And then that one thing led to another. And so in a sense, what I've been doing for the past 20 years is trying to write the history of Britain and potentially the world through the medium of rugby, about basically saying why rugby, both league and union, explain how the world is and how they reflect the way that the world has changed since not just since 1895, but going back to the origins of rugby in the 1850s and 1860s. So that's basically how I got here, and in a sense, that's been helped because I'm a fan, and so I work with a lot of people in the game, such as Rugby League Cares and the RFL on various heritage projects. So I'm both a disinterested academic historian and a diehard rugby league fan.
Tony, would there be one lesson of history that you feel that the game doesn't heed and should? Are there things that in my short time involved, long compared to some people now, I see the same mistakes being made again, and the sort of corporate memory of the game is not what it should be. Is there one sort of recurring bungle that you see all the time?
Yeah, I think at a general level, I think you're absolutely right. That there's no the game seems to forget what happened in previous seasons when it makes decisions. And I think that, in a sense, that's the biggest problem, and that it's not able to draw the lessons or draw a balance sheet of what it's done in the past, and generally just goes right ahead and does a very similar thing as what it does in the past. And I think to some extent, that's in the nature of professional sport. All sports, if they want to make money, they basically are focused on how to get a winning team on the pitch and how to sustain that team. And that's basically the extent of their horizons. But the reality is that for a game as a whole, and for clubs as well in a different way, you've got to have that long-term perspective. You've got to be able to draw the lessons of the past so you don't repeat the same mistakes over and over again, which I think we do. And I think, the main problem that the game has always suffered from is short-termism. And that there's been a lack of willingness to think strategically over the long term about where we want the game to be in 5, 10, 25 years and work towards that. The game is too easily blown off course either by finances, whether that's lack of finances or what tended to happen in the 80s and 90s, people with money coming into the game and setting up in Britain anyway, setting up clubs in very unlikely places where the game was never likely to succeed, and wasting a great deal of resources. So there's always been that, and the game's inability to see beyond the present day and work strategically. Because I'm not aware, I might be wrong, I'm not aware that either the NRL or the RFL has any strategic plan. Most of it, I think the NRL is driven by, well, quite often, and no disrespect to your previous career, Steve, by what's in the Sydney daily papers, or by the needs of satellite TV companies. And in Britain, it's not quite the same because obviously we don't have the same, we don't have the same power or popularity in Britain as the game in Australia. But it's very easy for the game to be thrown off course, as we see over the past 10 to 15 years, by picking up one initiative and then just dropping it with no explanation when it seems to be not working out or difficult to implement.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question and I'm going to sign off. Firstly, I know that you want to, at the end, if you could just, tell people how they can get hold of your book. But I will preface that by saying the book is available in both Mascord Browns stores, Mascord Browns with a Z.com and Mascord Browns with a Z.com.au. And also, this show is on Patreon, Patreon/White Fever. And also at the moment, to record this history, this weird time we live in, we're doing a crowdfunding campaign to print 10 match programs to finish the season with all the games in both hemispheres. So you go to Kickstarter and look up Rugby League and you'll see that. And there's about 11 days to go on that. This final question is not the broad brush esoteric one you'll be expecting. It's actually about Hull KR. You said you're a Hull KR fan. How will the history of the club be affected by Neil Hudgell's departure, do you think? What fears do you have, and what impact will it have on I guess what people like yourself are recording in another 100 years' time as far as your favourite club? And if you could just basically anything you want to say about your own social media channels and how to get hold of the book, give us that as well.
Well, on Rovers, I think the first thing that any Rovers fan will say is that we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Neil Hudgell. When he took over the club, it was in a very, very pitiful state. Its future was in doubt, and what future it had, it seemed to be to play at a low level and always play second fiddle to our dear neighbours in West Hull, which is obviously a terrible thing for any Rovers fan, anybody living in East Hull. It was Neil's foresight and vision and execution of that that has brought us to where the club is today. And it's testimony to him and to the players and the fans that we're still in Super League, and also that the club has. And I think this is important, often forgotten about. The club has recovered its position in its local community in East Hull. It does some fantastic community work in a place where things have gone not well in terms of jobs and wealth over the past 20, 25 years. So yeah, he's done a fantastic job. Where this leaves the club, it's difficult to say. I mean, hopefully someone with a similar vision and similar commitment to the club is going to come in, and hopefully that commitment is a financial one. In a sense, the club's an attractive proposition. It's got a great supporter base. I mean, the average crowd is somewhere around 8,000, despite the fact, clearly we're not amongst the very top tier of clubs. And the club's now developing a reputation for playing some very attractive and open football. So, but who knows? We just have to keep our fingers crossed and hope that whoever replaces Neil can do a similar job in keeping the club where all Rovers fans want it to be, and that's in Super League and hopefully challenging for honours at some point. So, I mean, that's my two penneth. Personally, I hope he doesn't go. That maybe he'll change his mind and we'll continue. The relationship will continue for a long time. But he's his own man, and we'll just have to see. In terms of contacting me, you can contact me through my website, www.rugbyreloaded.com, and you can listen to my weekly history podcast, which looks at rugby league and also all the other football codes. So we talk about union, American football, and even soccer, and more importantly, the links between all these games. And that's at rugbyreloaded.com, and you can get me on Twitter on @CollinsTony.
That's awesome, Tony. It's been half an hour. I appreciate your time. If you are a bit concerned, viewers and listeners, that the audio's dodgy, don't worry. When I fix it up later for replay, the audio will be pristine. It is, unfortunately, a bit of a glitch with the live broadcast. So thanks, everyone, for joining, and congratulations on your new book, Tony, and enjoy the rest of the weekend's rugby league. There's plenty on this weekend, actually, with Challenge Cup as well. So everyone enjoy their rugby league this weekend, and we'll see you perhaps next week.